Okay. All right, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. I see many of you are arriving now from all over the globe. This is so exciting. Thank you for taking time to be here with me today for this free online event. So let's go ahead and get started with BPD and relationship problems presented by emotionallysensitive.com. Okay, so just to make sure you're in the right place, I value your time, want to make sure that this is something that can potentially benefit you. Let's talk about what this webinar is about and who it's for. I'll do a little introduction about who I am, and then we'll get into the topic of BPD and relationship problems and an opportunity to do some questions and answers too if anything comes up that you'd like to ask. So this webinar is about relationship problems that you might have if you have borderline personality disorder, BPD traits, emotional sensitivity, or emotional dysregulation or a trauma history. So essentially, if you experience your emotions intensely, if they sometimes feel disproportionate to current events, or if your emotional intensity is causing problems in your romantic relationships, friendships, workplace, school, family, neighborhood, etc., then this is a potentially helpful session today because we're going to be talking about what causes us to sometimes struggle with emotion regulation and dealing with our emotions and having them come on so intensely compared to, say, other people who don't have that similar experience, and how we can begin to work on that and potentially, hopefully, over time, with consistent practice, begin to see real changes in our relationships, which are pretty much the most important thing on the planet to most people. Not necessarily just romantic relationships either, but having really close friendships or being truly close with family members, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and take a look here. I will add that it's very common that the romantic relationship is the primary concern for a lot of people when they are signing up for something like this. I want to acknowledge those of you who are experiencing that as well. Okay, so who am I? My name is Debbie DeMarco Bennett, and I am a teacher of DBT skills here at emotionallysensitive.com. And I'm just going to go through the points here and maybe elaborate a little bit on some of them. I have a Bachelor of Science degree with a focus in behavioral science from NYIT. I have been teaching DBT skills here at DBT Path, emotionallysensitive.com for 6 years now. And I also have personal DBT skills training as I myself am in recovery from borderline personality disorder. So back in 2010, I was diagnosed with borderline as well as PTSD, or more specifically CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was referred to DBT locally in my community at that time, which was what ultimately changed and saved my life and set me on the path of creating the life that I want and now teaching these skills to people like you who want to learn them. And I no longer meet the criteria for a BPD diagnosis, which is totally possible and practically unheard of for a lot of mental health issues and mental illnesses, that you can actually do work that will restructure your brain, restructure your nervous system, and over time no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for something as serious as borderline personality disorder. So it is possible. My story is a living testimony of that. And so I had several years of personal DBT skills training before I went into it professionally. So I attended DBT groups and actually continued to attend them for several years into my professional training and studies as well, to keep myself on the path and keep myself engaged in the skills, which is now coming, of course, more easily because of how long I've been doing it. All right. And I'm an author of 2 traditionally published books on borderline personality disorder and DBT, and they're called Stronger Than BPD and the Stronger Than BPD Journal. The second one was co-written with Catherine Holt, which I'll tell you about in a moment. I'll tell you about her. And I also have 2 self-published titles, Healing from Borderline Personality Disorder, as well as Stop Sabotaging. It's a 30-day DBT challenge, that particular book. And all of those books were written under the name Debbie Corso. I took a pen name initially when I went into talking about my own personal story, just because of the sensitive nature and how private some of the things are that I have shared. But now I'm out there as my true name, Debbie DeMarco Bennett. But if you were looking for my books, you would look under Debbie Corso. I'm a professional life coach. I'm certified. And I have an interest in neuroscience and somatic studies, so I do engage in additional coursework to pursue those interests and to bring that knowledge to our class, which I'll tell you about our class later as well. I'm a researcher on the topic of ancestral intergenerational trauma and healing, which I'll also touch upon tonight in terms of how that's connected to emotion dysregulation. And I have a certification in early childhood development, which has really helped me to understand a lot of what's going on for many people who come to the classes that we have at emotionallysensitive.com, who have borderline personality disorder or BPD traits, emotional sensitivity, dysregulation, and so on, who have also had early trauma or childhood trauma, and how that impacts the brain, the nervous system, how we respond to things emotionally, etc. So that's a little bit about me from more of a professional perspective, and very briefly, so you can get a feel for who I am as a person. The picture just to the right of my profile pic is my husband and I. We got officially married last year. We just came up on our 1-year anniversary, wedding anniversary. And these are pictures of us being very active together. So you can see us dancing, rock climbing, doing some hula hoop dancing. You see me with my cat, Gray Bear, doing a head boop right there. And then my other orange kitty, Frankie. And so this is my family. And the reason I love showing these active pictures is one more thing I'll share with you about myself is that shortly after really truly feeling like I was in recovery from borderline personality disorder, no longer meeting that criteria, my life going really well, I was told I have multiple sclerosis, MS, and I received that diagnosis several years ago. And when I first received the diagnosis, of course, it was quite devastating. I was able to handle it, and I felt so grateful that I'd had DBT skills to handle the intense emotions and thoughts and everything that was coming up with receiving that diagnosis. However, I also lived in fear for quite some time. It was very sedentary and was not doing anything active because I was so afraid. And my husband helped me to come out of my shell and begin to do the types of activities that you see on this slide, as well as other things like riding my e-bike and scooter and so on. And so I wanted to share that as an encouragement, because I know a lot of us who have mental health issues or issues with emotions, oftentimes, unfortunately, and there's a possible reason for this scientifically, when we may be predisposed to certain conditions, and it's the environment that we're in, and including our thoughts and reactions and responses to things in that environment, that can determine whether those genes are expressed. And because I was in a pretty violent, unstable family home as a child and went into foster care after that and group homes, I was my nervous system was getting set up for certain things to happen. And oftentimes when we experience trauma, especially trauma that is before the age of 3, we will develop these chemicals that will go into our organs and then develop into illness later in life, is what some of the studies are showing now. It's actually pretty fascinating. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because many people who take this course also have a chronic physical condition. Usually it's an immune system issue, immunodeficiency, or something of that nature. And so it's interesting to see that science is starting to talk about this possible correlation between early traumatic experiences and developing these types of illnesses later in life, and these skills that are taught at emotionallysensitive.com and that we'll talk about a little bit tonight in this webinar are some of the things that have helped me to claim my life back, even in the face of all of the stuff that comes with a serious chronic illness. So I wanted to share that with you and share a little bit of an insight into who I am. So yeah, let's continue on. So it's not just me at emotionallysensitive.com, although it'll just be me tonight for this webinar, but I just wanted to introduce you to the team that makes all of this possible, which includes Catherine Holt, who is a licensed psychotherapist who takes a psychospiritual approach and is amazing. She co-facilitates the classes with me at emotionallysensitive.com. Kim, who is our community administrative coordinator and our study hall moderator, and Peggy, who is our senior admin and study hall moderator. And study hall is a private space where our students can share homework and ask questions and connect. So thank you to the whole team, and I am ready to get us started here. All right. So the types, let's start out by talking about some of the types of relationships that can be affected if we have intense or dysregulated emotions. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. However, it's pretty comprehensive. So the types of relationships that can be affected include, but are not limited to, romantic, friendships, family, workplace, school, community, authority, and of course you may be thinking of even more. And today what we're going to be talking about is these top two here because they are frequently talked about in our course. The rest of this list, these different relationships, are also discussed in our course, but as you can imagine, some of the primary concerns that people will come in with are issues around romantic relationships with their partner or with friendships. And so we'll take a look at these tonight for the sake of time, since we can't cover all of them. And as I go into this, I would like to emphasize that I have zero judgment for some of the things I'm about to say and about to share in terms of, for example, why someone would have unhealthy maladaptive behaviors in relationships and the types of behaviors and things that perhaps you're doing. And the reason they'll be included in this presentation is because they are so common, and you are in the right place, and you are here to learn about some things you can do to help yourself with these particular behaviors. And I have no judgment, and I have so much compassion for you, and I want to invite you to notice if any self-judgment, condemnation, criticism comes up, and to give yourself some of that self-compassion, because if no one ever taught you how to handle your emotions in relationships or in the workplace or in a friendship or at school, etc., how would you know? So there's a reason why we have these behaviors, and they work for us to a certain extent to get our needs met. So they have a nugget of wisdom in them. But if you're in a class like this that we teach, or if you're on a webinar like this, perhaps you're noticing that those particular behaviors are no longer serving you. So they may have worked to a certain extent for a certain time, but they're also causing problems for you. So we just want to look at that with curiosity, non-judgment, and lots of self-compassion, and really care for that part of us that's been doing the best that it could with the knowledge it's had to try to get our needs met, because that's all this maladaptive behavior really is. We do these things in order to try to get our needs met because we don't know a better way, or we may know a better way but we haven't practiced it enough for our brain to easily go to that option when we're having an upset time or an emotion that's really strong or feeling triggered. So with that in mind, let's continue on and take a look at some, again, not an exhaustive list even here, even though it's quite extensive, 25 items of romantic and friendship type issues that we sometimes might see come up. So, all right, so I'm just going to read through just so you can see if any of these resonate for you. And if you're on a cell phone, they might be really tiny, so I want to help you guys out as well. So, repeating unhealthy relationship patterns and partners. Now, this can be within your own relationships of noticing that you pick the same type of partner and have the same type of problems over and over, and or repeating unhealthy relationship patterns and partners that you witnessed as a child that your caretakers had. So let's say your mom consistently over and over ended up with men who were alcoholics. And then when you start to get into relationship, you get into relationships with men who are alcoholics. So it can be either and or. So next one is afraid to be alone or codependent. This has a lot of roots oftentimes in the next one, which is the fear of rejection and abandonment. Being alone can feel intolerable for some people who have emotional sensitivity or BPD, and there are layers to that and multiple variables and possible reasons. I will share with you that personally, and a lot of people can relate to this, it's not everyone's story. For me, I had one of the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder is identity disturbance, and that was one of the prominent symptoms I had when I was diagnosed. It's no longer a part of my criteria. I no longer meet that criteria. Excuse me. But at the time when I was diagnosed, I was terrified to be alone. And I had a partner who would go to Europe on business and to visit family. And each time he went, I would get so physically sick from the anxiety and panic that I would end up in the emergency room needing an IV because I was dehydrated. No joke, it was that extreme. And so not everyone's story is quite that extreme about their fear of being alone, but it was for me because I was like a chameleon and I would behave in ways that I thought would please the person I was with at the time, whether it was my partner or a boss or a friend or a neighbor or a family member, which got really exhausting and is what led to my break that led me to the intensive outpatient program where I got diagnosed with BPD. But just to share, that fear of rejection and abandonment and that fear of being alone can get us into some sticky situations and keep us in relationships that really don't feel healthy or that we really know aren't healthy because we're just afraid of being alone, which I was terrified. So I totally get it. Then I chose to be single for many, many years before I finally met my husband. So I know it's possible to do this work and to get to the point where if you're someone who literally gets sick, and it doesn't even have to be that extreme, when you're alone and you're afraid to be alone and you feel like you don't know who you are, you don't have a sense of identity, and it's really scary, you can get to the point of enjoying time alone and not being scared like that, because I was one of the worst case scenarios and it turned around using DBT skills, which I'll tell you a little bit more about what those are in just a bit. Excuse me again. Okay. Next, let's look at trouble with being assertive or too demanding. So these are two ends of the spectrum, right? So if we hold things in and don't ask for our needs to be met, that can cause problems in relationships, both romantic and friendship. And if we're too aggressive, if we are too demanding, we can also push people away or cause damage to a relationship. So that's a place to look as well. Lack of confidence and self-esteem, myths about being undeserving or not good enough. So these are messages that we perhaps learned over time or came to believe, and we address these in our interpersonal effectiveness course at emotionallysensitive.com about identifying these and really trying to figure out where they came from. And we don't always have to be able to do that to move forward, but sometimes it's interesting to see, hey, this was my mother's belief or my grandmother's belief, and I am deserving and I'm good enough. And it's like this transformative moment that can happen. Suppressing needs is similar to what I was talking about with not being assertive enough. Volatile, emotionally intense, abusive, perhaps that there's this presence that feels this way in your relationships, and it could be that you are acknowledging that you're generating most of this or the other person is generating it, or maybe it's in equal parts. Trouble being honest, and again, if this is resonating for you, it's not about judging you. It's not about saying you're a bad person if you have trouble being honest in relationships, because again, we learn to interact in relationships and communicate in ways to get our needs met that we may no longer need to do. And that's why we would want to learn a new method, a new way to approach relationships, right? So one of the ways that sometimes we can have trouble being honest is not necessarily lying, although that's one of the ways, but it can also be exaggeration. So feeling like we need to exaggerate the intensity or how bad something is in order to trust and believe that someone is going to show up and help us or respond to us, that is a common thing with people who are emotionally sensitive. Learning to, basically trust that you can get your needs met without having to go there. Sabotaging relationships that could be healthy, trouble trusting, jealousy. That's a big one in romantic and friendship relationships, that people want to learn, how do I move past the jealousy that is really causing me to sabotage my relationships? Trouble creating and enforcing boundaries, don't know how to get our needs met, which is part of all of these. Unrealistic expectations of others and ourselves and of relationships in general. We might have an issue with disconnecting or dissociating, so we're checking out and not fully present in the relationships. Reading minds, which is when we think we know the intentions of another person or what they're feeling or what they're thinking, and we really can't know that. And what happens is we often, as emotionally sensitive people, can fall into the trap of having that strong emotion, having that compelling thought about what that other person must be thinking. Oh, they're going to leave me. Oh, he doesn't love me anymore. Oh, she doesn't care about me anymore. And the problem is we don't see it for what it is, which is a thought, and go to automatically believing it. And then our body starts responding, our emotions start responding, and then we start behaving as if it's real. And then we, unfortunately, sometimes create a self-fulfilling prophecy and push that other person away. So that's another example. We can be really sensitive to criticism and feedback. It can feel like a dagger. So we talk about that in interpersonal effectiveness and throughout the modules, actually. How do we cope in that moment when someone's just trying to give us constructive criticism, but our automatic reaction is that this is a threat? And a lot of times that comes from childhood, with being expected to be perfect and there being terrible consequences if that doesn't happen. And that's not always the case, but it's pretty common. Social anxiety can cause difficulty in romantic relationships and friendships, of course, and a previous history of bullying or exclusion where you were victimized in that way, and then that mentality and those experiences are carried over and are playing out in current day relationships. And then mood-based shifts on keeping plans, which we hear about more on the friendship side, which is you want to have friendships, you want to have relationships, you want to have connections, and you make plans. And then the day comes and you feel too anxious, or you feel too depressed, or you feel too this or that, and you just send a text and cancel it. But over time, that erodes or can erode relationships. And so how do we show up and keep our word despite our mood, if our mood shifts? And yeah, so this is a sampling of some of the ways that emotional sensitivity or dysregulation can show up in the context of relationships, specifically romantic and friendship. So let's continue on. All right, so this next one is about the sources of problems in relationships. Again, none of these lists are exhaustive, but what we're doing is using the most common ones that we hear about in our courses from our students. So starting with trauma, yours and intergenerational. So what do we mean by this? So we have trauma, some of us, or many of us, I would imagine, that we experienced in childhood, perhaps in adulthood. And then we have what's called intergenerational trauma, which means that any kind of trauma that your mother or father may have experienced, as well as their parents, could be influencing us in terms of our own relationship problems today in a variety of ways, including involving these coping mechanisms that our ancestors learned to cope effectively were passed down to us, and we may no longer need them. So for example, it doesn't even have to be in the context of a relationship, but if one of our grandparents was in a war and became extremely hypervigilant and responsive to certain sounds, and we're still reacting that way, that's an example of how a trauma can be passed down, because the way that evolution would see it is that we need that because it's thinking that we're being born into the same world and circumstances as our ancestors, but we're not, gratefully, in a war. and our bodies are still responding in the same way. So we have to learn ways to calm our nervous systems and cope effectively with that. And also, another way that trauma can be transmitted intergenerationally is through behavioral transmission. So, if your mother, grandmother were treated a certain way as children or in relationships as adults, their worldview of relationships, how relationships work, how they should show up, how their partner should show up, what kinds of things happen, what kinds of things don't happen, influence how they perceive the world, how they then parented the next generation. And we witness this, right? So we witness it in the parenting and grandparenting that we receive. However, it might be skewed. It might not be true for us in our relationships today, and could be a source of problems, misunderstandings, and things that we're dealing with. So this is one of the newer components to the interpersonal effectiveness course at emotionallysensitive.com that we're adding in, which is really fascinating. I should mention at this point that the classes that I'm talking about are really holistic in nature, so they cover not just DBT skills, but all of this other stuff. I'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, and so modeling, which I essentially covered there as well, and then something called skills deficit, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a few moments. So what can help? That's really important and what we want to look at today, right? And learning to cope effectively when we're triggered is what can help. And you notice that effective has an asterisk, and that's because in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, the type of skills that helped me and that I'm going to go over a little bit with you tonight, we ask ourselves when we go to change a behavior, or we look at a behavior, is it effective? And then we say effective for what? And we say effective for my short and long-term goals, which we have to get clear on. What are my short and long-term goals in terms of romantic relationships, friendships, workplace relationships, and family relationships, etc.? So we want to learn to cope effectively for our goals when we're triggered. And we can do this in a few ways. And one of them is by understanding our nervous system health. So these reactions that we have in our bodies, the physiological symptoms that we have chemically, hormonally, etc., when we're activated and when we're triggered, just having that knowledge alone can be so helpful and empowering, because we know what's going on when we start to feel things in our body, and it can be less scary and we can move through it with more ease and tend to ourselves in a way that's caring and loving and brings us back to regulation more quickly than without doing these types of things. So for myself, once I started learning things about nervous system health and DBT skills, my rebound time or recovery time from being triggered and completely dysregulated and feeling like I couldn't function in the world went from that lasting, let's say, almost a week to maybe like a day or even a half a day. And sometimes, if it still happens today, which it does occasionally, I will recover within a few hours to a day. So it can be so empowering and very, very helpful. And somatics is the experience, it's tied into this nervous system health, of noticing what's going on in our bodies with body sensations and connecting that to the emotional experiences that we're having. So, for example, if when you were 7 years old, something very frightening happened, and at that time, there was a certain smell in the air, or a certain song was playing, or you had just eaten something and had a certain taste in your mouth, or you got nauseous or had a certain sensation in the pit of your belly. Now, in present time as an adult, sometimes when we get, when something is startling to us or upsetting, we might notice that sensation in our bodies and begin to panic and think, oh my gosh, I'm having an anxiety attack, I'm having a panic attack, where it's just a physical sensation. But because the brain paired it and associated that physical sensation so long ago with something traumatic, it feels like trauma is happening in this moment too. So we talk about that as well in our course. Understanding your trauma history info as well. So going to psychotherapy and talking about the things you have been through, the things you have experienced, and the things that you're aware of from your family history can all be very, very helpful at coping effectively, because having this knowledge gives you new information so that you can make new choices about how to respond in the moment when you get activated or triggered. All right, what else can help? All right, learning to notice our belief systems, stories, and myths about how relationships should look and work and how we and others should behave in them, etc. We can use a skill called fact checking, which is basically challenging the thoughts and intense emotions we have in the context of our relationships when they're causing trouble. So let's say your husband is pulling out of the garage and heading off to do something, and he says, I felt really pressured by the way you worded something earlier today, and I wish you could have asked me instead of making me feel like I had to do it. What would your reaction be if a partner said that to you? For a lot of emotionally sensitive people, it would be very frightening to hear that, because there would be a physical sensation, maybe in the pit of the stomach or in the chest or somewhere else in the body, connected to a past trauma. And then there might be this thought, oh my God, he doesn't love me. Oh my God, I failed. I didn't do this right. He's upset with me. What if he doesn't come home? Like, all of these things can go through our brains. With fact checking, we're challenging these things because we can't believe everything that we think or that we feel. And I get it that it's really compelling to believe a frightening thought when it's accompanied by an intense emotion like fear, anxiety, or panic, or has those body sensations coming up for us inside that are associated for us with fear and panic and anxiety. But it's life changing when we begin to analyze and look at those moments when we're triggered, when things are really intense, and slow it down to the best of our ability and start to look at, is this even true in this moment? Can I fact check this? Is it certain that that's what he was thinking? That's what he was feeling? Remember earlier we talked about mind reading, and we can't do that with people. Does it serve my goals to go down this road of becoming dysregulated and staying stuck in believing thoughts that may not be true, or intense emotions that are coming up? What else might be true? So it could be this person, my partner, was being assertive and asking for his needs to be met, and that scared me for a moment. So you can break it down into facts. So my husband said, da da da, whatever the quote was that I said, and then I had the thought, I'm afraid it means he's going to leave me, or I'm afraid I failed, I'm afraid he doesn't love me as much. And I had the emotion of fear, anxiety, or panic, and I noticed these sensations in my body. So this can be really helpful, because a lot of times when we're emotionally sensitive or easily dysregulated, what we've come to do is just believe intense emotions and scary thoughts at face value. So this particular skill, this tool, can help us by actually looking and checking the facts and seeing if there really is a threat present, because oftentimes there isn't. It's our fears and our thoughts, but not something that's actually really happening in this moment. So we end up suffering unnecessarily, and we can begin to reduce that with this particular skill. Next, understanding the science and impact of ancestral intergenerational trauma as well as early trauma, and beginning to release it. So I talked a little bit about that early on with epigenetics. So we used to think that if our ancestors had certain diseases, like for example in my family, pretty much all of my grandparents and then even a previous generation died of heart disease and heart failure. And so it used to be that, and there was diabetes in the family as well. And it used to be that you would think when you got older that that's what you're going to die from. That's what you're going to go on to develop. But now we understand, as I was mentioning briefly earlier, that even though we inherit DNA, we also have what are called epigenetic tags on our DNA. And those are what determine if something actually expresses in the gene. So this means that you can come from a family that has all types of physical things with their heart and with diabetes. And because you choose a different lifestyle, maybe you're more active, you eat more healthy, you go to your doctor's appointments, you get monitored, you may not ever go on to develop that heart issue. And so we look at this in the context of trauma and in the context of releasing trauma, in the sense that Well, it's a really vast world actually, but just for simplicity's sake, like dealing with anxiety, dealing with emotional sensitivity, and how we can choose to begin to rewire the neurocircuitry in our brains so that we're not necessarily responding in the same ways that our ancestors did to upsetting stimuli and to triggers and things that activate our nervous systems, which takes us into nervous system health, somatics, dealing with sensations, which I already went into a little bit. Psychotherapy, of course, finding an awesome therapist who can help you and support you through working through these issues can be invaluable and highly recommended in terms of working through this stuff on a deeper level. And perhaps you're someone who finds comfort and support and help in spiritual counseling or coaching. So, this is another area that can be really helpful for working on regulating intense emotions, is to take care and to seek services and connection and support in these areas. So, I told you I was going to get into DBT, which is primarily what we teach at emotionallysensitive.com. It's the foundation of our courses. And learning and integrating DBT skills into your life can be life changing. And again, it's what helped me to shift from fully meeting the criteria for borderline personality disorder to no longer meeting that criteria and radically changing my life. So, why don't I give you a brief overview in case you're not familiar with it? Some of you are. Some of you have been following me for a while on social media and such, and on my email list, so you know a little bit about DBT. But let's just go back to basics for a moment for those who may not be familiar with it or have not heard of it before. So DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. And it's a fusion, interestingly, of cognitive behavior therapy, which is changing our thoughts and challenging our thoughts and working with cognition, which is our thoughts, and Zen Buddhism. And Dr. Marsha Linehan fused these two practices together and created dialectical behavior therapy, which is used in a variety of settings and has been secularized so that it's not potentially an issue for people who don't want to invite certain aspects of spirituality into their lives. So you get to take what works for you and leave what doesn't. It's basically this balance of acceptance and change as illustrated on the screen. So change is something that's emphasized and pushed and done a lot in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and acceptance is a concept that's really, really rooted in mindfulness and in Zen Buddhism. And so instead of just focusing on change like we would in cognitive behavioral therapy, essentially in CBT, the skills that we learn in DBT balance accepting things the way they are and then going from that place to make a change. And paradoxically, it really does take acceptance before we can change anything. We have to acknowledge and accept something. So even someone, for example, who wants to change their drinking habits, let's say you realize you have a problem with drinking, you have to accept that you have a problem with drinking before you can change it. If you're in non-acceptance, you're not going to get to the point of changing, right? So DBT takes that into consideration, and there's this balance and this working of going through accepting and changing throughout the whole process. All right. Okay. So the first item on here I mentioned earlier and said I would get into is skills deficit. And it might sound a little insulting, but what it essentially means is not insulting at all. It's actually a place where we can have true compassion for ourselves and anyone we care about and love who is borderline or who has BPD traits. So it means that we didn't receive these skills. We didn't learn these skills or have them modeled for us or taught to us, or for some reason didn't retain them. Maybe it was a unstable environment as children to cope with our emotions. And so that's where the deficit comes in. We're saying people that have BPD or BPD traits or emotional sensitivity or dysregulation are not flawed. There's not something wrong with them inherently. It's that they didn't receive these skills. So how are they supposed to know how to cope and how to deal? So that's part of the philosophy of DBT, is that if you're coming to a DBT skills course, it's because you're needing these skills and you need to learn them as an adult, which beautifully is totally possible and life-changing for many people. DBT is divided into modules. Mindfulness is the foundation and basis of all of it. And a lot of programs will have a separate module on mindfulness, but we find it so important at emotionallysensitive.com that we actually, instead of separating it out, do mindfulness at the beginning and throughout all of the other modules, which include distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness skills, which is starting on Monday. So going back to what can help in terms of DBT, learning and integrating these skills into your life can be life-changing because you're choosing something different. So whatever you have been doing that's only been partially working or not working at all is ingrained. There are neural pathways that are deep because these are the behaviors we've been choosing over and over again. And so our brain goes for the lowest hanging fruit. And when we get triggered, when we get activated, the first thing we want to do is the quickest way to relief, the quickest way to feel better, right? So sometimes that looks like cutting, sometimes that looks like overspending or eating or having sex or whatever it might be for you. It could be quitting a job, just whatever it is to get that stress out quickly and get away and to feel better is often the type of maladaptive behaviors we're talking about. When we begin to learn DBT skills and integrate them, we are offering our brain another option. So in that moment, to get from A to B, we don't necessarily have to go to A.1, which is cutting or doing whatever that activity is. We can now do A2, DBT skill, to get from A to B. And the more we do that, the more we practice it, the easier it becomes to continue to make that choice. And it can be really hard and really challenging in the beginning because think about it. You've been doing something a certain way for so long, it just becomes almost like an automatic reflex. So we really have to slow it down. And the mindfulness does really come in and play a big part of that, as well as the cognitive behavioral skills of making a different choice over and over and over again until it becomes easier, which is totally possible. So ideally, I like to tell people to get into a local group if you can find one. I was able to do mine through Kaiser Permanente, which was a real blessing, and it was a very helpful group. However, what I began to see as I was online and blogging and putting my stuff out into the world were a lot of people saying that there were these common obstacles to getting into an actual live in-person group in their community. One of them being that it's cost prohibitive, just way too expensive for them to afford, and their insurance sometimes covered it, sometimes didn't. Long waiting lists, a year, 2 years, 3 years, I heard, for some places. And sometimes they're not close by. So this was the case for me. It was a 45-minute commute each way. And social anxiety, maybe you're not ready to sit in a group with people and do this work yet. Or maybe you're a public figure or have a privacy concern. So when I say public figure, yes, we have celebrities who take our course. We have people in government who take our course. But we also have people in the community who are teachers or police officers or attorneys or otherwise are some type of public figure in their community, and they have privacy concerns and don't want to come and speak about these types of things in an in-person group. And so these are just some of the reasons why we might feel like we're coming up against obstacles when it comes to in-person DBT groups, which is why I'm going to lead into talking about another thing that can help that I've been mentioning and sprinkling throughout this presentation, which is our online DBT group courses here at emotionallysensitive.com, which start on Monday. And I created this course because of those obstacles that stood in the way. I just couldn't believe how many people needed or wanted to do this work and learn these DBT skills who, for the reasons mentioned and other reasons, couldn't access it, couldn't do it, couldn't be a part of this, and it was unacceptable to me. So I started teaching this online, and I co-facilitate these courses with Catherine, the licensed therapist I introduced you to at the beginning. And we are now serving students from around the globe who want to learn these skills and be part of a community and do this work. And it's a holistic online DBT informed course. So we provide DBT skills education and practice, weekly homework with personalized feedback, which I feel that is essential and really important, because if you don't know if you're applying the skills correctly and you're not having the progress that you're hoping for, it makes sense when someone could come along and say, okay, well, this isn't exactly how the skill was intended to be applied, so let me help you. Let's tweak this, let's shift this. So getting that personalized feedback and also the encouragement when you have a skill success can make all the difference. When you're trying to just do this work using a workbook and doing it on your own, it can be a lot more challenging. Okay, we also go over nervous system health and recalibration techniques, somatics, and as I mentioned, we're bringing in more on the ancestral and intergenerational trauma. And we talk about common issues in relationships of all types. So, not just romantic and friendship, but anywhere that you can imagine having a relationship and having a relationship problem, we can address that. So, we also cover all of these issues that we talked about in the context of romantic and friendship relationships. And then again, family, workplace, school, community, authority, and other types of relationships that may be applicable to you. And the thing about the weekly homework with the personalized feedback is that you get to take the assignment and tailor it to a way that it's meaningful in your life. So you can put in specific examples and get feedback on how to work through a particular issue or how to apply the skills in a particular relationship with a very specific scenario going on. So if you're interested, please do join us. There's still time to sign up at emotionallysensitive.com to join us for interpersonal effectiveness, to learn even more skills, learn more in-depth information about the things I began to go over with you today. And I hope to see you in class. And until then, I just want to acknowledge there have been so many awesome questions. I see them popping up as I'm as I'm here doing this, and I want to begin to address them. So I'm going to start scanning the questions, because a lot of times by the time I get to this point, a lot of the questions have been answered, right? So you ask something early on and then I end up addressing it. So I'm going to look and see if there's something I haven't addressed, and I want to invite you now to continue to put questions in the Q&A box right now of anything I haven't addressed, or that you want more information on, or that you want me to expand upon, or you have additional questions about. Let's do this. Okay, let me see if I can get just my camera going. If tech's going to cooperate, we'll see. Slides up first so I can take your questions and read some of your lovely comments too that are coming in. You guys see me? Oh, I wonder if there's a way to do it some a little bigger. There we go. Whoa, that's huge. Okay. All right. So let me go ahead and see what some of your questions are that are coming in. Thank you guys for joining me, and thank you for the ones who have hung in there till the very end here. I hope that I can help you with an answer to something that you may be curious about from the presentation or DBT in general. So let's see. Oh, well, that's nice. Thank you, Joe. Joe says, thank you for making such a difference, Debbie. Your YouTube videos have helped so much. Joe, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you for telling me that. Thank you, Lee. Chris is asking, is there a way to save this webinar to share with my partner affected by BPD? Yes, Chris. So within 24 hours, probably much sooner than that, of when we end tonight, I'll send out a link so that you can watch it again. You can share it with whoever you think it would be helpful to share it with. And so, yes. Elizabeth's asking, how much is the cost? I'll get to that in just a minute, Elizabeth. Thank you for asking and for being interested in the course. I'm going to take a few couple of other questions related to DBT, and then I'll definitely get to that. So hang in there. Okay. Angela says, I don't understand the identity, the loss of identifying who you are. Tell me a little bit more about that, Angela. So are you personally affected by that, or are you curious because you know someone who has that symptom, or because you heard about it for the first time tonight when I brought it up, so that I can tailor the answer as best as possible? Let's see. Sheila, that's a great question. Sheila's asking, what can we do at home when we're feeling that fear, that panic of being alone? And there are several things that you can do, and one of the things we wanna keep in mind is this recurring theme that I've talked about tonight of nurturing our nervous systems, because what's happening more or less when we're going into those panic and anxiety states when we are alone, whether it's because of a recent breakup, whether it's because someone's traveling, whether it's because we've been single for a while, is that our nervous systems are getting activated. Something within us is telling our brains and nervous systems that there's danger, there's imminent danger, and we're getting freaked out. And or you might also suffer from the identity disturbance that I talked about earlier, where being alone is connected to some type of trauma, or it's connected to not knowing who you are and panicking because you don't have someone to mimic or someone to behave in a way that you're pleasing them. I hope that makes sense, because for me, what it looked like is I had a partner, a boyfriend, and when he was around, I felt safe because I would be constantly trying to do things to please him and make him happy, and then kind of checking and getting feedback and seeing if that was working, and I felt safe. When he wasn't around, I didn't know what to do or how to behave or how to act. So, um, that kind of goes into Angela's question about identity. Angela, I'm not sure if that helps to answer your question a little bit more as well. But Sheila, some of the things we can do in DBT, there's something called self-soothing, as you know, Sheila, as a student of DBT path or past student. Um, Self-soothing is when we choose to soothe ourselves through our senses. So through vision, through smell, through taste, through healing and healing. But that was probably not a mistake. Hearing and through touch. So we look for things that are pleasurable to take in through our senses, to give our brains and nervous system a different type of stimuli, to give ourselves something that feels more nurturing and more soothing to help us calm. And then this might sound really silly because DBT was put out in the early 90s, but Dr. Linehan has recommended that if you're feeling really lonely, you can call 800 numbers or numbers where you would order something or ask questions about a product just to have human communication. You could do this with a friend or someone you really know as well, or a support hotline, things of that nature, but just feeling like you have that connection. For me also, and this is not for everyone, some people don't like to have the television or radio on, but I found that that was somewhat soothing to put like a talk radio or some type of program where there was a lot of, uh, like Ellen or something like that, where there are people engaging in conversation and having that on in the background. And I know it doesn't solve the problem of being afraid of being alone, and it doesn't solve the problem of being alone. However, anything we can do to manage that anxiety and panic and the resulting urges we might get to do unhealthy behaviors so that we can take better care of ourselves while we're moving through that grief or moving through that sadness or moving through that fear of being alone is a positive, right? So that's one thing, self-soothing. Distracting is another, so getting yourself involved in some activities to keep your mind busy. And the activities that are best are the ones that you can really throw yourself into. And this is another thing we say in DBT. I don't want to offend anyone, but we don't want to half-ass it. So we don't want to say, I'm going to do this project to get my mind off of being alone, and then we're like not totally committed to it, and then we're still letting ourselves drift into the thoughts and letting it spiral out of control with the emotions. We want to throw ourselves into the activity as much as possible. Again, sending information to our nervous system that we are safe and that everything is okay. We might be uncomfortable, it might be unpleasant, we might hate the fact that we're alone, but we don't have to let it totally dysregulate us or cause us to engage in behaviors that we're going to regret. All right. Caitlin's asking, if I can't make the first session, will the class be available on a link to watch at a later time? Yes, Caitlin. So the weekly DBT class is live on Mondays at 4 p.m. Pacific for an hour, but it is recorded because we have a lot of international students who just can't make it at that time or who are working during the day at that time. So you do have access to it during the week at your convenience so that you can review it. Grant wants to know when the recording of this will be available. Within 24 hours, Grant, I'll email it out to all of you, probably much sooner. Let's see. Oh gosh, you guys, so many great questions and comments coming in. Give me a sec to scan here. Okay, so Debbie, hi Debbie, fellow Debbie, is asking, I appreciate this video loads. So I was wondering, can this DBT course alone help with BPD? Here in South Yorkshire, England, therapy is very, very, very limited. The funding is shockingly bad. I honestly just want to get better, and this DBT course is really my only hope. Also, is it common for someone with borderline to experience extreme fatigue when they can't face getting out of bed and dressed? Is it common to get so angry because you have to go out and it stops you from going? Great questions, Debbie. So I'm going to refer you to look at after this webinar to go to emotionallysensitive.com and click on reviews so that you can watch the video testimonials of students, some of which are in that very same situation where this is the only resource they have and this is the only resource they can afford, and what it has done for their lives, and see if anything resonates as far as what they say. Look at all of the things that are offered to see if it will feel supportive to you, and give it a try. I'm hoping that it will be a source of help to you, that helps you grow in your confidence around your emotions and starting to recalibrate and re-regulate your nervous system. So I hope that that is true for you if you choose to sign up, Debbie. And one of the reasons why there are so many possible reasons, but one of the reasons why we can get extreme fatigue if we're someone who has BPD is, think about all the energy that we're exerting when we have intense emotions. It takes a toll on us. And in the class, we also get into nervous system, neurobiology, the anatomy of the nervous system, in terms of what happens when I get triggered, what happens when I get emotionally activated, and why sometimes when I logically know I'm okay, like I've gotten over it, I know I'm safe, I've just had this big panic attack, this anxiety attack, why is my body still responding with a fast heart rate, sweaty palms, nauseousness, lack of appetite, diarrhea, all this stuff? And I'm not a doctor, so please talk to your physician if you have any symptoms like this. I'm just sharing what I know from my own personal experience, as well as working with hundreds of people who have BPD traits and emotional sensitivity who experience this, and my own studies, that our nervous system gets activated, our sympathetic nervous system, and that's when we get all of those reactions inside our body. And then we can logically know that everything's okay and that we're fine, but then the sympathetic nervous system takes a lot longer to come on board, and that's the part of the nervous system that starts to regulate things back to normal with the heart rate and digestion, etc. So that is common, extreme fatigue. And among our students, they often share that. And having an emotion like anger and being angry that you have to do something and it stops you from doing it, the second part, yes, that's the mood-based decisions that we were talking about earlier, and it's a challenge that a lot of people with BPD and emotional sensitivity struggle with, and that we address and work with you on in the course. So I want to make sure I'm very aware of the time, and there are so many questions coming in. I told Elizabeth I would share with her the cost information. So let me put that up really quickly. Oh, the questions were blocking my camera. I didn't realize there was such a delay between my mouth moving and the words I'm saying. Okay, let's see here. Okay, I'm not sure if you guys can see that. Let me see if I close my camera, if it helps. I know that's kind of tiny, so I will read it off to you. So the program is 9 months in length to complete all 3 modules, including the mindfulness component that is weaved throughout. And it does, there are price breaks if you pay in advance. So if you pay in advance 9 months for the whole program, it's $797 US dollars, and that saves you $202 US dollars for the program. If you pay 3 months at a time, it's $299 every 3 months, and that saves you $34 every 3 months. And then we also have a pay on month-to-month sliding scale which is often our most popular for people who aren't quite sure and they want to test it, or if budget is an issue. And that starts at 111 a month for those of you who want to go month to month. So I just wanted to make sure I address that. And I want to put this up for you guys to check out as well. And I'll come back on the camera in a sec. That this class is ideal for you if boundaries are a blur and you get very triggered when others violate yours. You aren't sure how to set healthy ones and get them respected. You get told that you're pushing other people's boundaries. It sometimes costs you the relationship. You're empathic and you take on other people's emotions. And you can read through the rest if you'd like while I'm looking at questions. But basically, emotions are impacting your relationships in life. And there are some examples. You have an identity crisis, or geeking out on science lights you up and you want to learn more about some of the things I brought up and additional information. So let me see. Questions keep coming in. So before I'll answer a couple more questions and I'll let you guys go. I realize it's been an hour. But what you can do is go to the Facebook event page and I'll send you all the link to that as well with the recording. If you have any additional questions that I haven't answered or haven't gotten to yet, you can post them there and I can respond to you on there as well. So let me just see if there's anything else. You're welcome, Chris. Yep, Kim, who you met on the team page, she wanted me to mention that we have Study Hall, which is this private area. We used to use a Facebook group to discuss homework and questions, but for privacy concerns and a lot of us just not wanting to be on social media very much, we migrated over to a private moderated forum that's moderated by myself, Catherine Holt, who's the therapist, Kim and Peggy, who you met earlier on. And that's where we share our homework, get feedback, ask questions, engage in community discussions, get announcements, all that sort of thing. It's a really neat space. Thanks, Kim, for mentioning that. All right. Gosh, just so many. Okay, I'm just going to read one more from Candy. Candy says, I just enrolled recently and think this is a godsend for me. I was triggered big time, but my previous DBT skills I previously learned helped me so much. What would have taken me weeks to cope only took me overnight this time. I realized I made the right decision in enrolling in this course. Awesome, Candy. I'm so looking forward to working with you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your own personal experience too with applying these skills and seeing it make a difference. So everyone else, please look for the link that I'll email you if you still have a question so I can respond to you. And if you're interested in signing up for the course after this webinar, please go to emotionallysensitive.com and click on classes. And I will see you in class on Monday, which is totally awesome. And you are now on my email list. So when I do other events, whether they are free or paid, you'll know about them. And you can unsubscribe at any time. But if you found value in this, you might enjoy some other things that I put out. So hopefully you'll choose to stay on the list. All right, everyone. See you over at emotionallysensitive.com. Bye for now.